welcome to Beyond the Scales, starting the obesity conversation, where we unravel the complexities of obesity. I'm Emily, and I'm joined by my co-host, Fran.
Hi everyone, we're two medical students on a mission to demystify obesity, as there's so much more to it than just a number.
We're honoured to have Consultant Bariatric Surgeon Mr Lee Humphreys working with us on this podcast, and he's going to bring a wealth of clinical expertise to help us navigate this complex condition. Hello, Lee.
Hello, evening ladies. Nice to see you again.
So we were wondering if you could talk to us a bit about ultra-processed foods, as there's a lot of confusion about what they actually are and the positives and negatives around them.
Sure. So, I mean, it's a great topic, and it's a hot one at the moment. There's lots about this in the press. Now, disappointingly, the definition of what an ultra-processed food is not entirely nailed down, and there are some discrepancies around it. But broadly speaking, it's food that's made with industrial formulations. And it typically contains more than 5 ingredients that most of us would find difficult, if not impossible, to find in our own kitchens to be able to replicate the food domestically. Right. And so that's a reasonable, I think, practical definition of what an ultra-processed food is. Back in 2009, a Brazilian man called Monteiro classified foods according to the NOVA classification. From group 1, which is what we would recognize as unprocessed or minimally processed food, such as fresh fruit and vegetables, meat. Then you had group 2, which is processed culinary ingredients, which contains things that were made from group 1 food. So, for example, vegetable oil that's made from crushing seeds, so like rapeseed oil from rape seeds. Then you get up to group 3, which is processed food. And processed food is made by adding sugar, salt, oil, or other group 2 type foods to ordinary food, and usually to prolong its shelf life, because mainly that's what processing food is all about. And then finally you get group 4, which is ultra processed foods, which is what we're talking about. Now, the NOVA classification is a little bit complicated. But, you know, if you look at a packet and if it's got ingredients that you don't recognize, you know, most of us don't have, flavor enhancers in our cupboard or stabilizers or gum, you know, it's probably ultra processed.
Okay, so I think we're eating a lot more ultra processed foods than we think then, by the sounds of it, because, I mean, I hadn't really heard much about it until recently.
No, I just associate a lot of ultra-processed foods with ready meals, and lots of on-the-go stuff.
The answer is they're everywhere. In the UK, on average, 50% of what we eat is ultra-processed. So the average adult in the UK is eating around 140 kilograms of ultra-processed food a year, and drinking about 124 litres of ultra-processed drink, which is effectively soft drink, fizzy drink, a year. And so, you know, a very, very significant proportion of our diet is now coming from ultra-processed food. And there are a variety of reasons for that. One, it's actually difficult to avoid, even if you know what it is and you're looking out for it. You know, some breakfast cereals that people might think are reasonably healthy are ultra-processed foods. You know, it's cheap, it's quick and easy. You know, ready meals are a great example. But, you know, if we look at a list of what, you know, ultra-processed foods, so what have we got? Crisps, ice cream, fizzy drinks, ready meals. You know, the list goes on and on. And so, yeah, we are consuming ever increasing amounts. And is it a problem? Well, it is a problem because we are now realizing that the consumption of ultra-processed food is contributing to the obesity crisis. And there are a variety of reasons for that. You know, when you process food, you're effectively stripping out the good stuff, for want of a better term. And you also strip out flavour. So when you're making meals that you're constituting from bits of other food and putting them together, they don't taste of anything. So you have to add in things to make it taste. And what do we put in to make things taste nice? Well, surprise, surprise. It's sugar, it's fat, it's salt, and then it's things like flavour enhancers and other things that you've never heard of. So you're getting high fat, high sugar, high salt content food. And critically, most ultra-processed food is very low in fibre and low in protein. And those two things are also important. Calories, we've all seen calorie counts on the back of food packets, or on the front of food packets, or in menus, or in restaurants. But the amount of calories in a food doesn't tell the whole story. What's really important is how available those calories are and how much energy it takes you to metabolize that food. Because if you have to work harder to metabolize it and the calories in the food are harder to get at, then you will extract less calories from eating that food. And this is where fiber is really, really important. So fiber minimizes the absorption of sugar. So if you eat an orange, a whole orange, there's a load of fiber in there and there's a load of sugar in there. But the fiber minimizes the amount of sugar that you absorb. If you juice that orange, you're basically destroying the fiber and you're getting all the sugar, which is why a glass of orange juice actually contains more sugar than a can of Coke. Most people don't know that, and most people think orange juice is a healthy alternative. Well, it's got vitamin C in it, but it's got a hell of a lot of sugar. And fiber is also really important for our gut microbiome. So it keeps all those billions and trillions of bacteria that are really important for our general health and the gut happy. And so eating low fiber foods is not good. And ultra processed foods, as we've said, tend to be high sugar, high fat, high salt, low fiber, low protein.
So on the other end of that, what do you think about and what do you tell patients about all the stuff that you see that's 0% and low fat and reduced fat and all of the food stuff that advertises that as a method of lowering your calorie intake? What do you think about those?
Well, that's all marketing. So this all came from the 1970s. So in the 1970s, there was a debate about heart disease. You had some British scientists who felt that sugar was probably a major causative factor in heart disease. And then you had some research from America, funded by the sugar industry, that actually suggested it was much more to do with high fat and nothing at all to do with high sugar. And eventually what happened is the American argument won out. So that's why we saw at the end of the 70s and into the early 80s, all of these really high profile campaigns about we must reduce the amount of saturated fat that we eat. Fat causes heart disease and strokes. So therefore we created an industry with low fat food. It was everywhere. Yeah. What happens to food if you take fat out of it? Doesn't taste very nice because fat tastes nice. You ask a patient who we've told to go on a zero fat diet because they've got gallstones. It's really, really boring and they don't like it. So when these companies take fat out of the food to make it taste nice, they put a load of sugar in. So most zero fat or low fat food has actually got, certainly processed food, has actually got a lot of sugar in it to make it palatable to the consumer. So it may be low fat, but that absolutely does not equate to healthy. They're two very different things. And it's all about marketing.
I was watching a Panorama episode and it was talking about ultra processed foods. And in there, one quite large segment of it, you can watch it on iPlayer, it was talking about aspartame.
Yeah.
And talking about how that artificial sweetener and the impact that has not only on obesity and things, but also on your cancer risk as well. But then it was quite interesting because it was delving into how lots of research articles and things have, there's quite a lot of contradicting evidence, but it's actually because there's a lot of affiliations with other companies and things like that, which must be so difficult for somebody that doesn't understand or doesn't look at that when reading a paper or appreciate that. So when it comes to informing patients and things about, eating and things without making them become totally obsessed and potentially even stimulating you don't want them to have a eating disorder, how do you then go down the route of guiding of what to eat, what to avoid, things like that?
Sure, that's a great question. And the answer is it's really difficult. It's very difficult to avoid processed foods, even if you consider yourself to be well educated on the topic, because they are ubiquitous and they are easy. And we also need to appreciate cost, because for a lot of obese patients, they are on low incomes.
Yeah.
And so there is this notion that you as an individual are in total control of what you put in your mouth. Now, I would challenge you and say, for people on low incomes, that is not true, because you have less choice around what you eat than someone who is on a high income. And ultra-processed food is significantly cheaper than fresh, unprocessed food. And so you can only have a free choice over what you put in your mouth if you have the free choice to buy whatever food you would like to or you think is appropriate. And, there's been a couple of studies done about the cost, but, if you look at matching calorie intake, let's say 2,000 calories a day on an ultra-processed food diet versus a non-processed food diet, it costs about a third more to eat the non-processed food diet. And if you're in a low-income household and you're feeding children, that's a big difference that a lot of people can't afford. So it's all very well as a doctor and obesity expert say you must stop eating ultra-processed food, but practically it's not easy, and financially it may not be easy. And I think it's completely unrealistic for us to turn around and say, as a society, we're no longer going to eat ultra-processed food just because it's such a huge proportion of our diet. But what we might be able to do is pressurize food companies in the longer term to make their ultra-processed food a little bit healthier, chuck in a bit of fiber, that sort of stuff. But what we really want to do is concentrate on unprocessed food, eating fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, meat, fish, if you can, that's not been processed and packaged. But there's a financial cost. There's also a time cost. People have busy lives, busy households. It takes time to cook from scratch. And also, not insignificant numbers of people that we come across don't know how to cook. Now, that may sound to us quite unbelievable. But if you've grown up in a household where your parents, your grandparents ate a diet that consisted in the majority of ready meals, microwave food and takeaways, nobody in the house cooked, then you don't teach people to cook. And so these are very basic sort of life skills but if you don't have them, it's very difficult to not consume ultra-processed food.
You mentioned a lot of these products have a lot of sugar. Do you think that part of the problem is kind of sugar addiction, and are people craving more of these foods because they've started having them?
So the combination that really gets people eating is a combination of high fat and high sugar. Those two things together really light up the reward centers in our brains. If you show people pictures of high fat, high sugar foods, you'll get the same response on a functional MRI as if you show heroin addict heroin. Very, very powerful.
Wow.
And food companies know this. So if you produce high fat, high sugar foods, we want to eat more of them. We are driven to eat more of them. Now, this is where I think it gets really interesting. In nature, the combination together of high sugar and high fat doesn't exist other than in one ubiquitous food that's everywhere in nature. And that is breast milk. Now, from an evolutionary point of view, so that makes perfect sense. You want babies to be actively seeking breast milk because that's where all of their nutrition comes from when they're young. So it makes sense that breast milk is addictive. But that's the only place in nature where that high sugar, high fat combination exists. And so there's a evolutionary basis for why high sugar, high fat food is very appealing to us and we want to eat more. And the food companies know this and they have known it for a very long time.
It's shocking, isn't it? Quite ethically challenging, particularly, especially with what we do, that, you know, they're okay with that.
And I think, like you said, it's the reward system in our brains that we want more of it, and it makes us feel good when we eat these types of foods. So it's got to be a societal change, hasn't it, rather than just an individual.
Right, yeah.
Steps you can do yourself.
At the current, cost of living at the minute, it's just insane how much vegetables are, how much they've gone up compared to beforehand. So it's what would you suggest that we tell individuals, that they tell us that they can't afford to eat healthy? How do we suggest that they introduce that into their lives then if they can't do it?
So there are some websites and there are some resources for trying to eat healthier on a limited budget. So there are some resources around there for that. But I think starting to try and educate people about what's happening when they eat these foods, because a lot of people are completely unaware. Yeah. And so actually, if you try to give some basic education and basic understanding to people, then some people will start to adjust their habits because, as far as they were concerned, they didn't know that what they were doing was particularly harmful because no one's ever told them. And this is what everyone that they know eats. So they know different to everyone else. So it's about trying to educate a little bit and empowering people to try to make better decisions, but not being judgmental. And that's the thing. You can't be judgmental. You can't be evangelical about it and say, I'd never eat a microwave meal. Oh, I never eat, I never eat a pizza. I cook all my food from scratch. Well, that's great for you. If you can do that, brilliant. But the majority of people can't. And we've talked about this in other episodes. We mustn't put our values and our life experiences on the patients that come in front of us. Just because we might find something easy doesn't mean everyone else does. And it's really easy to judge people. But we must do our best to not judge people because you will be horrified by what some of these people are dealing with.
I definitely think it would also affect your relationship as well, and how honest they would be with you, what's worked for them and what hasn't. And I mean, an additional challenge, particularly with diet and eating and things, is if you're a fussy eater, especially with children, that it's very easy, especially if you have a job and things, to give them more processed, pre-prepared food. And then when you have
and look, most kids don't want to eat vegetables.
No.
They don't want to eat things that are good for them. It's a battle. I've got 2 kids. I know what it's like. It's a battle to make them eat it. It's really easy to let them eat stuff that's high in sugar and high in fat because it tastes nice and they want to eat it. And it's difficult. It is very difficult. And I completely get why people are consuming so much of this stuff. But it's causing harm. We know that if you eat ultra-processed food, you tend to eat more. There was a study done by, I think, a guy called Hall from the US, that put randomly assigned groups of people to eating an ultra-processed food diet for 2 weeks or an unprocessed food diet for 2 weeks. And in that, they could eat as much of that type of food as they liked. And when the 2 weeks was finished, immediately the group swapped over. So the group that was on ultra-processed went to non-processed and vice versa. And what that study showed was that for the period that people were eating ultra-processed food, they were eating, on average, 500 calories a day more than when they were on the non-processed food diet. 500 calories a day is roughly 25% of your sort of average 2,000 calories a day for the average person over. And you can see, if you're doing that on a regular basis, understand why these foods are contributing to weight gain and contributing to obesity. And there's been quite a few studies looking at this now, and the link is being very strongly established.
So is that more to do with hormones or the reward pathway, or a bit of both? So why are we eating more of those foods then?
I think a lot of it is to do with the reward pathway. The food is formulated to taste nice, to be easy to eat, and to make us want to go back for more. And we're really bad at estimating how many calories are in food, particularly in sort of high fat, high sugar food category. We're really bad at it. And so, there are mechanisms that we're uncovering that we're now starting to understand why we're being driven to consume more calories. And as we've already said, the calories are more available to the body in ultra-processed food than they are in non-processed food. You have to work harder to extract those calories from non-processed food. So even if you're eating 2,000 calories of non-processed food versus 2,000 calories of ultra-processed food, you're extracting a much greater proportion of that 2,000 calories of the ultra-processed food than the non-processed food.
You mentioned earlier that the food costs less. Do you know why that is? Why it would be less money?
Yeah, because ultra-processing prolongs the shelf life of food. So, if your food is available on the shelf for longer, and you're using bits of animal for the meat stuff that you wouldn't normally be able to use if you're eating whole food. So your base ingredients are cheaper. Your product stays on the shelf for a lot longer. So all of that means that the cost of producing the food and storing the food goes down, so you can sell it at a lower price. Fresh fruit and vegetables, fresh meat, it doesn't keep for that long. No. It has to be used in a relatively short period of time. And so it's bulky. So there are storage costs for the supermarkets and the retailers, and all of that adds up and gets passed on to the consumer.
Yeah, it's very challenging. Lots of people suggest batch cooking, and things like that. And that again, that does work, and that's fantastic. But the issue again of knowing how to cook, freezer space, especially if you're batch cooking for quite a few people, that's another challenge.
And it's great. It requires a level of organisation. My wife and I have talked about this on many occasions. Have we ever actually got around to doing it? No. But
we do in our house all the time.
That is one thing. It does work for some people, but as we've said, you've got to be organised. You've got to plan your week in advance, and you've got to have somewhere to store it all. Lots of our patients live without freezers. They don't have somewhere to freeze food and keep it in a state where they can eat it throughout the week. But yes, that definitely works for some people.
And do you think in the future we're just going to be eating more and more of these foods because, if children are growing up with these foods, do you think it's going to kind of snowball?
I would like to hope, as we raise awareness, that the pressure will come on the food companies to reformulate in some way.
Yeah.
We know that pressure does eventually work. We know that high-level government intervention does work. We saw that with tobacco. Why have smoking rates gone down? Well, it's a combination of increased taxes on cigarettes, but actually making smoking socially unacceptable. The smoking ban, stopping people from smoking in public places, that has caused a very significant shift in the attitude to smoking. And so it's worked. It's worked with alcohol consumption. People are drinking much less alcohol than they did 20, 30 years ago. So it will be a combination of government level pressure, and government may have to legislate. Now, at the risk of sounding like a conspiracy theorist, the food companies have a huge amount of power. There are a handful of companies that control the overwhelming majority of food production in the world. These companies are incredibly powerful. They have a huge amount of political clout because they bring huge amounts of money into countries' economies, and they employ a lot of people. And so one of the reasons why government is reluctant, in my view, to legislate in places that they could, and the sugar tax has been a classic example of this, is that they're getting a lot of lobbying and a lot of pushback from the companies that make huge amounts of money out of producing this stuff. We saw it with, the tobacco companies in the 50s and 60s suppressed research when we knew that lung cancer and smoking were directly linked. And so we didn't start to see a shift in policy for probably a decade and a half after that was common knowledge. Why was that? Lobbying from tobacco companies. And we're in a similar situation with food companies. So it's a really complex problem, but you can't solve it at an individual level other than by making different choices. And eventually, if enough people do that, it'll hit profits. And if you start to see more and more press about, what ultra-processed food is doing to us, and more people trying to limit the amount they make, then you may see that companies will have an incentive to change. At the moment, they don't.
No, it'll be very difficult for them, obviously, if they need to make such a financial loss that they would have to be forced into it.
Well, who are food companies beholden to? They're beholden to their shareholders. They're not beholden to government. They're not beholden to you and me. They are there to make profits for their shareholders.
Yeah.
And so there is the conflict.
And do you think, like the sugar tax, do you think that has helped at all? Or is that in the right direction, do you think?
So the answer is it may have had some small benefit in kids. The government has railed back on where it said it was going to be. There were aims of reducing, I think, sugar by 20%. I can't remember the time frame, but I think we've gone past it. And why? Because they're being lobbied by the drinks companies. Yeah. You've got people sat on government advisory boards whose research is being sponsored by the very companies that they're trying to, bring taxes on. So it's a bit of a murky world. We have seen, in countries where there have been significant sugar taxes imposed, it has made a difference, either by companies being forced to reformulate their drinks. And that has happened. So, the big names have reduced the amount of sugar that's in some of the big name soft drinks because there's a sort of voluntary code going on in the background as well.
Yeah, zero.
Yeah. So it does work, but there's no doubt that taxation is a powerful lever. And then, of course, you have the argument that taxes like this hit those less well off in the pocket more. And we've seen it. There was a few years ago, the government pledged to ban buy one, get one free offers. Well, guess what? They've gone back on that again, blaming the cost of living crisis and other things. But, We've already discussed that lower income groups are disproportionately affected by obesity. There's much more of it in lower income groups. And so, I completely understand why making food more expensive makes it harder, but the types of food that you're talking about making more expensive are the types of food that are making people obese. And it's also no secret that low income areas of towns and cities have a much higher density of takeaway outlets than the affluent areas in those cities. So there are all of these correlations between low income and poverty and obesity and, poor food.
Yeah, and food preferences as well. It's quite common, isn't it? I was told by a dentist actually that the North prefer a much sweeter diet than the South. And they prefer having sugar added to a lot more things, so they have a lot more incidence of cavities and stuff compared to other geographical locations, which I found fascinating. So quite a challenge.
Well, I think we'll finish this podcast here. Thank you very much for chatting with us about this topic. Keep an eye out for our next one.
Thank you.
Yeah, nice to chat, and we'll see you for the next episode. Take care.